Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mariela Colon, and I'm with the Adult Services Department at Chicago Public Library. Tonight's virtual program is another in our ongoing series of literary, cultural, and civic programming, and in celebration of Asian American and Pacific Heritage Month. Today's event is part of our Voices for Justice series, which seeks to highlight author, thought leaders who can spark conversations in the areas of social justice. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring an online chat for questions from the audience for a brief Q&A following the conversation, so please feel free to ask questions in the chat. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Mia Manansala. Mia Manansala is a writer and book coach from Chicago who loves books, baking, and badass women. She uses humor and murder to explore aspects of the Filipino diaspora, queerness, and her millennial love for pop culture. She is the winner of the 2022 Rusa Reading List for Mystery, 2021 Agatha Award for Best First Novel, 2018 Hugh Holton Award, the 2018 Eleanor Taylor Bland Crime Fiction Writers of Color Award, the 2017 William Deek Malice Domestic Grant for Unpublished Writers, and the 2016 Mystery Writers of America Helen McCloy Scholarship. She was shortlisted for the 2021 Goodreads Choice Award for Mystery and Thriller and the 2021 Chirpy Award for Fiction for the Chicago Review of Books. She is also a 2017 Pitch Wars alum and 2018-2020 mentor. Her debut novel, Arsenic and Adobo, came out May 4th, 2021 with Berkeley Penguin Random House and is the first in the Tita Rosi's Kitchen Mystery series. The sequel, Homicide and Halo Halo, is out now. I want to thank her for leading the discussion with tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Anthony Christian Ocampo. And a reminder, before I turn it over, we welcome your questions throughout tonight's program, so please place them in the comments section and we will pass them on to our speakers. So I'm happy to hand it over to Mia.
So hello, everyone. As Maria said, I'm Mia P. Manansala. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm so happy to be in a conversation with Dr. Anthony Ocampo. So I'm going to start with his bio real quick, and then we'll just dive into the conversation. So Anthony Ocampo, Ph.D., is a writer and sociologist from Los Angeles. He's the author of The Latinos of Asia, How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race, and a forthcoming Brown and Gay in LA, Queer Sons of Immigrants Coming of Age. His essays on race, immigration, and sexuality have appeared in GQ, Catapult, Colorlines, KCET, Life in Time, Prism, Gravy, Inside Higher Education, Chronicle of Higher Education, HuffPost, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Dr. Ocampo is Professor of Sociology at California Polytechnic State University, Pomona. He is also an academic director for the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity and serves on the Board of Trustees of the Filipino American National Historical Society. So welcome.
Hey, Mia, you can hear me, right? Clearly?
Yes.
I'm very happy to be here in Chicago. I mean, I really mean this. Chicago is one of my favorite cities, and I'm glad to be in Congo with someone who's from Chicago, so this is awesome.
Yeah, so I was saying beforehand, so Anthony and I had kind of connected earlier this year due to my writing, but I had actually owned this book for years. And it first came out, what, 2016?
2016.
2016. And I remember seeing it on the shelves. And, you know, I was born and raised in Chicago. I grew up in the Hermosa neighborhood. And for someone who looks like me and grew up in that neighborhood, I was like, oh my God, there's someone else who has my experience. You know, as someone who is not mixed, but everyone assumes that I am, when I tell them that I'm Filipino, reading this book was really fascinating about how, not necessarily universal, but how like not alone that me and my brothers were in this kind of experience. So I'm really excited to be able to talk about this book and some of the topics you touch on.
Oh, for sure, yes.
Okay, so let's just go to the front. So you open the book with a story from the year you finished your PhD program. It's about a study where they were trying to figure out the connection between Asian Americans and alcohol consumption. And you mentioned that you were turned away because Filipinos weren't eligible.
Yeah.
So why did you choose this particular story to start the book?
Oh, wow. I just feel like in a lot of ways, that feeling of Filipinos being boxed out of the larger Asian American category was kind of the seed of how this book started. I mean, I know that the book was published in 2016, but a lot of the ideas from the book stemmed from my undergrad experience, which was like 15 years before. When I went from, a predominantly Filipino and Latino neighborhood, kind of like the one you grew up in, and all of a sudden went to a university where there were like no Filipinos, but there were a lot of Asian Americans. And I just remember, just doing inventory of these moments where Filipinos didn't quite fit the mold for what was considered to be Asian. So everything from our last names to, the religion, the Catholicism, Spanish words in the language. And I thought, hey, this is kind of something worth exploring. It's just kind of funny because I think a lot of folks do research and they like to study identity. And here I was trying to understand like disidentification, which is a totally different thing. But I feel like it, in a lot of ways, it really shapes this was a silly story where I was trying to sign up for a study. I was in grad school, so I was broke, but trying to sign up for a study, and it said we need Asian Americans and Asian Americans who drink alcohol. And I thought, this is great. I can make some easy money. And then I was told by the study coordinator, sorry, but you don't qualify because you're Filipino and we need a genetically similar sample, which I thought was the funniest rationale because A, I knew that Filipinos were part of the Asian American movement, but B, I felt like that was the last straw. Like I'd seen all sorts of stories. Like I've seen on campus at UCLA, they had like an Asian bone marrow drive. And when people were giving flyers out, I noticed they would give them out to mostly Asians, but then when a Filipino would pass by, they would skip them. So I thought there's all these moments where Filipinos getting boxed out or Filipinos confusing folks about their racial identity really has real impacts on their everyday lives.
And I want to kind of clarify, like when you're saying Asians, are you talking maybe like specifically like East Asian, the way most people are, or do you feel that Filipinos are also different from like other Southeast Asians or the South Asian experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think with Asian, most folks, like everyday folks, are often thinking about East Asian groups like Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans. In other words, not thinking about the brown kid with the last name Rodriguez that might have like a rosary around his neck or a rosary in this rear view mirror in the car. And so
your Honda Civic.
Your Honda Civic or Acura Integra, depending what era we're at. But yeah, it's like a funny feeling to go like navigate the world where you feel like you're the only one that feels this way. And the cool thing about having done these interviews is I realized that there were Filipinos all over Southern California that I met who were having the exact same experience of not only feeling different from other Asian Americans, but also feeling a sense of kinship with Mexican Americans and other Latinx, Latina folk in LA.
So on that note, since we're kind of touching on like some of the stories but there was one that I found really interesting. One of the young Filipino American men that you interviewed said they wanted advice, dating advice for some reason. They had just started dating a Vietnamese American woman, and he stated that it was the first time he was dating someone outside his race. And you were like, oh, but didn't you tell me that you dated Mexican American women during our interview? And he's like, oh, that doesn't count. Mexicans and Filipinos are the same. But somehow dating a Vietnamese woman was different. What were you trying, like, why did you include that particular story? And like, why do you think he might've felt that way? Where someone who technically was within the same racial category felt so different to him, while as, a Mexican American was like, oh, same.
Yeah. First off, let me just say, I love these questions. The book's been out for a while, but I've never gotten these like questions that center the stories of the book. So I'm like super grateful for you doing that. But, I think with the reason that story was interesting, where this Filipino dude was like, oh, Mexicans and Filipinos are the same, is because over the course of my conversations with Filipinos, when they talked about everything from growing up in their neighborhoods and the schools they went to the, the churches that they would attend side by side with Mexican Americans, the newsworthy part about those connections was that the connections between Filipinos and Mexicans were not newsworthy to them. And the way I like to explain this is, I remember telling this story, or I had a student that read that part of the book. She was Mexican American, and she read that part. She's like, oh my gosh, that just triggered a memory that when I was in school, whenever I'd have my Filipino friends come over to our house, I would just tell my mom, like, oh, mom, this is my friend Jennifer, right? But if I was inviting like a Chinese American friend to my house, I'd always say to my mom, this is my Chinese friend Alice, right? And so there was this like blurring of the boundaries between Filipinos and Mexicans. And I think a lot of it has to do with all of those cultural markers, like the fact that a lot of Filipinos and Mexican Americans and Latinos are Latinx folks are Catholic. And even if they're like not practicing Catholic, the idea that like the Catholic Church is just ever present in these communities. And then other moments where, if you're living alongside, like your experience in Hermosa, I'm just imagining that when you're growing up and you hear someone who is of like Mexican American descent or is Latinx saying words, and as a Filipino, like, oh, I know those words, like miércoles, jueves, viernes, like, or like pantalones, zapatos. At some point, you're like, why are the words the same? Like, you need to figure out some understanding of like, how is it that our two cultures that are, oceans apart are able to have the same words? And I think those cultural markers are what kind of provide the building blocks for Filipinos and Latinx folks to form connections with each other in ways that just feel super organic.
Yeah, growing up, again, like my best friends their families were from El Salvador and Colombia. The majority of my neighbors were Mexican or Puerto Rican. I grew up speaking a lot, like I can't speak Spanish, but I knew Spanglish because all my friends used Spanish. So like you pick up on a lot of, like the verbiage that your friends use and like the style of speech. I wasn't trying to sound away, but when you grow up in a certain neighborhood, you pick up those characteristics. And I was just like, and I never thought about it until I went to high school. Because I went to a small Catholic school in my neighborhood in Hermosa. So it seemed so natural. And you enter that larger world and you're just like, oh, it's only natural to me because this is how I grew up, but not everyone has this particular experience. So it was really, fascinating to me.
And how many times in your life, in your neighborhood, has someone who's like an immigrant approached you and just started speaking Spanish, like from the jump?
All the time. It is like my husband's favorite thing because everyone always assumes that I'm Latina. Everyone thinks that I speak Spanish. People have gotten mad at me when I tell them that, like, oh, I don't speak Spanish, and I try to explain that I'm not Latina, and they're like, oh, why no? I'm like, I'm not lying to you. Like on a less light note, it's also touched on in the book. Like I've experienced much more racism as someone who is perceived as a Latina woman than as, no one is perceived. Because part of the book, and it's something I've always felt that I felt, really strong. Like in my mind, nobody can tell me that I'm not Filipino, right? Like I know who I am, but I also cannot ignore that the way the world perceives me changes how they, interact with me and certain opportunities that come away and the way they treat me. So like that kind of disconnect of like, I know who I am, but that's not what other people see is really, fascinating.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I gotta put you in touch with my partner because he's same background as me, child of immigrants from the Philippines, but he phenotypically navigate when he's maneuvering on the world, everyone assumes he's Mexican American. And in fact, it was so funny that like I was dating him for a good like 3 months or 6 months, and then at some point my aunts and uncles discovered he was Filipino because he responded to something they said in Tagalog, and they were like, oh my gosh, I thought you were Mexican. But to your larger point about the way that Filipinos who are racially ambiguous navigate the world, I think that there's a lot of moments where they get racialized as Mexican American, and depending on the context, that could be a positive experience or a negative experience. I know with my partner, for example, I think about sometimes he'll talk about his experiences in school. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, I wonder what your teachers thought you were, because you could very easily pass as Latinx. And so it's funny, because I think that's the larger takeaway from the book, is that the rules of race, they change depending where you're at. And in some ways, I like the first title of this book, before it has a title now, was Racial Chameleons. And part of it was because I thought that, what color Filipinos are depends on the background surrounding them.
That's actually, it's like, I have like a little pin that I wear that just says like ambiguous, because everyone, like what people racial, it's really interesting because it does change where I am. So, here in the US, most people go Mexican first, Puerto Rican second, and then they just start going down the list of all the Latin American countries trying to guess what I am. But I spent 3.5 years teaching English in South Korea. And when I was on the opposite side of the world, everyone assumed I was South Asian. They thought I was Indian or Pakistani, or maybe somewhere in the Middle East, because again, the proximity for them, right? Mexican is not something that would pop into their head because it's not as close there. So wherever I moved through, and then throughout the world, they'd say like, oh, are you this here or this, that, but never quite Philippines. Even when I was in the Philippines, meeting my family, I'd meet my father's side of the family, and I'd be like, oh, this is Nilo's daughter. They're like, oh, what's the mother? Because they just assumed I'm mixed because I look so, not typical. Not that there is a typical, which is, comes up again and again in the book.
Yeah, and you know how that people are like miscategorizing you or seeing you as not Asian, because when people are willing to talk shit about that racial group in front of you, and you're just like, do you know that like I'm technically part of that category? So I don't think I wrote it in this book specifically, but I started to realize there were a lot of moments in my life where me and some other Filipinos would be in spaces that were predominantly either Latinx or African American, and or even white, right? And the people there would talk smack about Asians, and from them being willing to talk smack about Asians for whatever reason, racism or jokes or whatever, it just illustrated that they didn't see you as part of that group, because if they did, they definitely wouldn't be making those kind of comments in your presence.
Yeah, exactly. Even in front of, like, if it's just we're just joking, because I'd point out like, oh, like, if again, because this is high school, high school kids say dumb things, they would say, and I'd be like, hey, I'm Asian. Like, oh, no, you're not, you're Latino, because like all my high school group were Mexican, Guatemalan, Puerto Rican, my El Salvadorian childhood friend. And they were just like, no, you don't count. You're one of us. And it's just like, there was a feeling of belonging and like truly being welcome, but also like denying who I was, but not purposely. They just truly saw me. They're like, no, Asian is other, you're just like us. That can't be.
Yeah, that happens. And I think the part that ends up being even more dangerous is when you're in spaces where there are white gatekeepers who's very, very let's just say less nuanced understanding of racial experiences start affecting you. And I think you can relate to this because you're in publishing. We're both writers, and we often have to deal with like white editors and white gatekeepers who may only have a knowledge of those stereotypical tropes of what an Asian is or what a Latinx person is. And what's funny is when I start talking to people that are in these cultural industries, whether it's writing or acting, actually it comes up a lot with acting. There's a lot of Filipino actors that are out there that talk about how their audition experiences, first of all, they're already people of color, so it's like that's already a ding. But when they do have casting calls for the Asian character, they go, and then they're told, actually, the Latino audition week is next week, right? Or vice versa. Like, there's this moment where Filipinos are like, well, they see me as Latino, so should I start auditioning for the Latino roles because that's the only place I can land an opportunity? and then they grapple with this like conundrum of like not wanting to be like the Rachel Dolezal of like the Latinx community. So it's complicated. And for those actors that are really trying to not only land jobs so they can make a living, but also render our experience on the on the silver screen, it sucks because the people that are determining whether they fit the job or not are often not Asian Americans. It's often white folks.
Yeah, I've been very blessed. So I have two editors, and both of my editors are women of color. My senior editor is Latina. The junior editor is Korean American. And so, there are times where like they've stepped in because they do. I get a copy editor who is, maybe not Asian. I'm not going to presume white, but possibly based on the name. And then they'll question certain cultural aspects. And I have to be like, did I not explain enough? Do I have to handhold? Is that my purpose right here? And then, so one of my editors would jump in and she'll be like, I know exactly what you're talking about. You don't have, it's fine. You can ignore this comment, and it's, it's just one of, I'm like, oh, having that backing where I'm just like, oh, are people not going to, so having that objective, like, no, you're perfectly clear. This is a her thing. This is not you. Being able to, but also being like, well, okay, I can see her point. Here's this. So like that nice balance where I don't have to keep questioning like, oh, do I have to change this for like the white gaze? Am I being too culturally specific and now no one's gonna understand? So it's really, really nice to have, to be lucky enough to have that.
Yeah, that is great. And you talked once before, we've talked about how like in Western literature or European literature, there's all sorts of things that they throw out that are totally culturally unfamiliar to the reader, and yet no one bats an eye when we have to read about something very specific to like the European context or like the American
I think last time we talked I brought up Jane Eyre because I love Jane Eyre, but I'm like, there are entire paragraphs that are in untranslated French, and I'm just like, well, I guess I'm just skipping ahead until I can understand what she's saying, and it's just like accepted, that's just how it is. But let's I want to backtrack a little bit, just kind of for people who are not like familiar with Filipino history and why we possibly have such strong ties to Latina culture. I wanted to bring up the colonial legacy because you brought up this, I hadn't heard this saying before, but I think it fits. It said, in the book you said, the Filipinos have spent 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood. Can you explain like kind of what that means?
Yeah, I can't attribute that quote to anyone because I've heard all different versions of it from family members, or in just when I'm in the Philippines, people will just say it as like, it's almost as common as like do unto others as you want others. It's like just a common adage over there. And so basically what that means is the Philippines was colonized by Spain for over 300 years. In fact, it was the Spanish period in the Philippines was longer than the Spanish period in a lot of Latin American countries, including Mexico. And so there was a long period of time where the culture of the Philippines was really influenced by Spanish, particularly Spanish friars, the Catholic Church. Literally, the Spanish went to the Philippines and had a catalog of surnames, because in the Philippines, they didn't have last names, like surnames were not prevalent. And so they were like, all right, this is gonna be your surname. And they had this book of like Spanish surnames they just expected the Filipino people to adopt. And of course, as you know from the words in the Filipino languages, like there's a lot of overlap between Spanish and Tagalog, for example. So it's oh my gosh, I totally blanked out on the question. What was the question?
It'll be like explain, like people who are not familiar with the history of the Philippines, and like that saying 300 years in the convent, 50 years in Hollywood.
Yeah, so the 300 years in the convent is kind of a play on that influence of like Spanish colonialism, but also Catholicism. And then the 50 years in Hollywood is the American colonial period, which was the first half of the 20th century, but arguably, still very much influenced by the American empire because of like military base presence. But with the Philippines, those things matter because when you're out in the street and you're trying to figure out what people are racially, you can look at what they look like, but you also look at these cultural markers. You also look at the way they speak, the words they use. And so these residuals from those colonial periods play a really strong role in how Filipinos are perceived by other people.
Mhm. And then, so this is kind of a little bit connected to that. So again, I've only been to California once, and I visited LA a few years ago. So for me, I was actually amazed at all the Filipino stuff on offer. Like Seafood City didn't even come here to, like, I don't know, a decade ago, less, I almost cried when I walked in and saw that. But, I went to LA and I was like, oh my God, there's like Filipino food trucks and Filipino cafes and Filipino restaurants everywhere. And there's a historic Filipino town. But in your book, you note that, first of all, most of the demographic that lives in Filipino town isn't actually ethnically Filipino. And you mentioned that there's not a real Filipino ethnic enclave the way other Asians have, right? There's no, like, the way there's like a Chinatown or a Koreatown or a little Saigon. Why do you think there's not really that kind of enclave, despite there being so many Filipinos? I believe that, like, Filipinos like the third largest immigrant group in the country.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't really have those kind of gathering places the way many other East Asian particular groups have.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And at some point, I'm like, when's the Crying in Seafood City essay gonna come out? Like
I have that, yeah.
Yeah, and so shout out to Crying in H Mart. But yeah, I think that with Filipinos, I think that, not to get all sociological, because it's my day job as I'm a sociologist, but it's very structural, right? And so if you think about the pre-migration experiences of the Filipinos that come to the United States, they went to school where English was the medium of instruction, right? Mm-hmm. My mom, growing up, would watch Bugs Bunny cartoons, or when in her schools, if she spoke Tagalog, they would be fined. They expected them to speak English. And so you can imagine, by the time Filipinos migrate here, they've had a lot of practice with the American way of life. Of course, it's still a very different experience, but they have a lot of exposure to American pop culture, the language. And what that means is that their ability to live in certain type of neighborhoods that are more racially integrated, it's a lot easier because they're not as constrained by the lack of language abilities. I know a lot of Filipinos say, like, oh, I have an accent, but as compared to a lot of other Asian immigrant groups who come and perhaps only speak Vietnamese or only speak Korean, in a lot of ways, the Koreatowns and the little Saigons and Chinatowns exist out of necessity, right? Mm-hmm. You got to have a place where you can buy groceries and, get social services and connect with other people. And that's a lot easier when everyone speaks the same language. But for Filipinos who, I guess, don't rely on, like, aren't sort of urgently, there's not as much of an urgent need for them to be only around other people that speak Tagalog or Ilocano. It gives them the freedom to kind of move wherever. And of course, like, we know that after 1965, a lot of the Filipinos that came to the US were nurses, engineers, a lot of professional or middle-class jobs, which means you have more resources to live in middle-class neighborhoods, which tend to be more racially diverse than, say, like working-class immigrant communities.
Mm-hmm. And then, so that kind of brings me to the next question. There was another interviewee. So throughout the whole book, I think you said that you interviewed maybe like 80 plus kind of young Filipinos. So there was one, lots of them stated that Filipinos aren't really Asian. And a lot of them had different thoughts on what divides, a Filipino from an Asian. Some of them problematic, but there was one that I found particularly interesting. Someone named it, I actually marked it in the book. And because his was a little bit more political. I'm going to paraphrase, like, I'm not going to read the full thing, but, like, to paraphrase, in his mind, in the US, when people say Asian, they specifically mean East Asian, and it connotates like a sense of power and privilege. Whereas a lot of Southeast Asian, are not necessarily in that same stratosphere, shall we say, monetarily, professionally, etc. So for him, he didn't consider Filipinos Asian, because we don't have the privilege, quote unquote, of East Asians, at least here in the US. What are your thoughts about the idea of being Asian and East Asian symbolizing like power, at least here in the West?
Yeah, everyone comes at this question with a different set of knowledge, right? There's and for some of the Filipinos I interviewed that are like actively engaged with geopolitics and the way the larger world works outside the United States, they started to think about how in Asia has its own kind of nationalist hierarchy as well. And you think about the countries that are the wealthiest, that have the most global power and global influence. There's definitely, tiers of which Asian countries are more influential, China being the most obvious example, or Japan and Korea. And with Filipinos, I think that sometimes, like, I'm not sure if these stories got mentioned in the book, but I think there were some Filipinos who even remembered when they go to the Philippines, they felt like the East Asians in the Philippines would almost like treat them less than in their own country. Like a couple folks said, yeah, there's a lot of Koreans that migrate to the Philippines, but they kind of stick to themselves and they don't want to like intermix with Filipinos. And I think it's because they think that like they're above us. That's not my words, that's someone else. Or even if you think about the Chinese class and the Chinoys that are in the Philippines, they tend to occupy more affluent echelons of Philippine society. And so it's interesting to see how like the hierarchies that exist 7,000 miles away across the Pacific come into play when Filipinos are thinking about their identity, like in the city of Los Angeles. And I think like that's also, you can't disentangle it with like the presence of Asian, like the way Asian is talked about in the city of LA. In LA, when people said Asian, they're almost always talking about East Asian groups. A lot of folks, they would, ask like, what kind of students do you have at your school? And they would say, oh, we have white students, Black students, Mexican American students, Asian students, and Filipinos. Like they would just mentally think of it as a different category as well. And I think that those are the kind of experiences that inform their decision making about whether they do or don't belong to the Asian category. But I'll say this, like in the year 2022, when there is a humongous target on Asian American women, and we've seen a lot of those victims be Filipinos as well. In a lot of ways, I think about how this current historical moment, if I were to have done the research for the book now, I think a lot of Filipinos I interviewed might actually have a stronger sense of Asian American identity because of all the attention that's happening on these terrible acts, some of which are against Filipinos. But I guess that's the point of race, is that identities are constantly shifting. They're not static, and they're constantly evolving.
Okay. I want to slip in one more question before we go to the Q&A.
Yeah.
So again, like you keep saying like in LA, and that's one of the things I noticed in the book. Because you've done some traveling, you mentioned that you really enjoyed Chicago, and obviously you chose LA because that's where you live, and that's where you can get in touch and actually physically interview the people. But do you think there is a difference between Filipinos and their identity growing up in California, where there's that huge Filipino and Latina community, as opposed to someone like me in Chicago, where it's a very different kind of similar yet different demographic, or a New York Filipino, or someone in like Nebraska? Do you think geography also plays into how we kind of see ourselves?
Oh yeah, 100%. So like this book was based on research done in LA, and it's funny when I never read your reviews, but like sometimes I'll read reviews.
I mean, that's 1000%. Yes.
Yeah, and sometimes people be like, I don't like this book because it's only based on people that are in LA, and LA is different from where I live. And yeah, it is really different, and it does it. The way identity plays out is so different depending on what part of the country you're in, and I think even neighborhood as well. So like, I found this trend when the book came out, and I would do talks. When you had let's talk about the Bay Area, right? When you had Filipinos from San Jose or the East, like Union City, the ones that were literally going like same situation of like going to school side by side with Latina people. They were vibing with the book, but then other Filipinos that grew up where the other like grew up around a lot of Chinese Americans, they were like, I don't really feel that way. If you talk to my cousins in New Jersey, a lot of whom like it's not as big of a population in New Jersey, and because of that, a lot of the Asian subgroups sort of coalesce together in ways that's necessary for them to be visible. For them, Asian and Filipino are essentially interchangeable identities. Whereas with my cousins in the West Coast, particularly if they grew up in like an LA or San Diego, they're not as sort of, they don't vibe with the Asian identity as closely as like my cousins from the East Coast. But what trips me out though is sometimes I'll meet Filipinos from places in the country like Texas, like some places in Texas where the only like some of them will say I totally related to the book because where they grew up, it was only white folks, black folks, and Mexican Americans. And so if those are the only three categories that exist, then the Filipino kid during kickball practice or PE or whatever, that kid's gonna get lumped in not with the white kids or the black kids, they're gonna get lumped in with the Filipino kid. I'm sorry, the Mexican American kids. Totally random story, but I was talking to a friend of mine who was formerly incarcerated, and he's Mexican, and we're just talking about like this topic of like race and incarceration. He talked about how, you know, every incarcerated person kind of had to find their way with one of the groups, but with Asians, it's kind of difficult because their numbers are not as large as the other groups that are in the prison system. And I asked him, like, where do the Filipinos go? And he's like, oh, you know, I noticed that the Filipinos in Southern California would be cool with the Mexicans, but then when I got transferred to Northern California, that wasn't the case. So like, there's so much. I mean, Filipinos are very complicated. You know, if our race was a Facebook dating status, it'd be complicated. But in some ways, I think that's the benefit of being a Filipino in this country, is that you're constantly experience this thing where you're confusing people. So it allows you to intimately understand like how race works in ways that maybe is not as easy for folks that squarely fit in a racial category.
That's really interesting. Even neighborhoods, right? Like, you know, like just because I'm a Chicago Filipina doesn't mean I'm just like like neighborhoods. And one thing it touches on lately in the book is also like class, which is something I very much experienced growing up. So I grew up in Hermosa, and my Filipino community was my immediate family. It was my family that I grew up with, my extended family. But my parents' Filipino friends were suburban Filipinos who were more well-to-do and more middle class. And I never felt like I fit in, even though we were all Filipino, because I was from a working class majority Latina neighborhood. I didn't talk the same. I didn't look the same. We had different interests. We had different backgrounds, even though we technically had the same backgrounds. And so just like class and neighborhood, it made a huge difference.
Oh, totally. I think that's where I love that intersectionality as a concept is much more present in our everyday lexicon, because the intersections of those identities really affect whether folks feel like they belong or not. I remember for this new book that's coming out in fall, I had a lot of folks like queer Filipino Americans who grew up in a very like strong Filipino environment, like family, neighbors, etc. But because they were queer and their queerness came into conflict with like what they perceived Filipino culture to be, which is like super religious. All of a sudden, their queerness became the rift. It created a rift between them and other Filipinos, which was an interesting thing to take note of. So, but you're right. I think class is with Filipinos. There's a tremendous class factor that comes into play, and class we can have all different sorts of convos about class. How Filipino, much like African American families, have very mixed income, extended family, like very, very wide SES when it comes to their like members of the same extended family. But also like the ways that class dictates where you live and how where you live then shapes your racial consciousness.
So I'm going to go, I don't want to make sure I don't want to run out of time. So I'm going to go to some of the questions that were in the chat. So did you always want to write books about your own community?
Oh yeah, no. No, I feel like it was like a matter of survival, right? It was, I feel like my writing is very motivated by like, if I don't understand something, I need to write myself to a place where I understand it. But to be completely honest, I think my desire to pursue writing was, I was lucky in that I had a Filipino American, my dog is like huffing in the background, so that's not me, that's like has allergies. But Schmidt. But I had a wonderful mentor, Dawn Mabalan, who sadly passed away. But she, you know, I was an 18-year-old kid and I was in a predominantly white university, totally lost, had like no effing idea what I was doing. One of the few Filipinos. And Dawn's class was a space where, unlike my other classrooms, we had the space to talk about Filipino-ness, write about it, read about it, intellectualize about it. And I just found that the experience of doing that made my college life so different. I went from someone that wanted to get the hell out of where I went to school to like really loving campus, because I felt like that the opportunity to write about my own community really grounded me, and it made me see that we had something to contribute, right? When you dig a little bit in Filipino history and you read about these incredible folks, like these incredible freedom fighters, from Larry Itliong to Philip Veracruz to Carlos Bulosan, like there's a lot of amazing people, men, women, non-binary folks in the Filipino community that are really making waves. And when you have the space to even read about a few of them, like it gave me goosebumps. And I just thought, if I could pick something up and read printed words that made me feel like my experience was rendered and like representative, and I could feel different in this space, then I thought, as corny as it sounds, like words are super powerful. Books are super powerful. The Philippine national hero Jose Rizal was killed because he wrote books that were controversial to the Spanish. So yeah, I am a dork, and I really believe that like writing is powerful. I mean, I would have never met you both had I not become a writer. Or sometimes, you know, I'll get emails. I just got an email from a Filipino kid in rural Alaska that read my book, and it's so cool to be able to connect. Of course, I didn't know that at the front end, but now that I know it, I'm like, wow, writing is a super powerful tool for community. I kind of like that Toni Morrison quote though. Like, I'm butchering it, but like, if there's a book that you want to read but it's not there, then you need to write it. It's totally butchering.
But you got the heart of it. You got the spirit of it. That's basically what it is.
Like, I just want to write a book that I want to write the book that I should have been able to read as a kid.
Yeah, exactly. Which is because I approach that from the fiction perspective, whereas, I always wanted to include Filipinos in writing because I never saw them. And when I did see them, it was about their trauma or their pain. And I feel it can be really dangerous to keep reducing people of color and queer people to only like sad, tragic, pain-filled, stories when there's so much. I mean, yes, it's not like super easy all the time, but there's so much joy and love in our lives, and we should be allowed to be seen pursuing that. I really want stories where we get to just be, like my story, like it's a humorous murder mystery where like a girl's ex-boyfriend drops dead in her family's restaurant and she has to solve the case. Like her being Filipino is incidental, she just is.
Yeah,
right?
and I love that. This is where I think fiction can really get at some truths that nonfiction can't, because like I think sometimes when I think about myself in the public sphere, it's often like oh, this person's, progressive person that writes about these political issues, but that's all people really know. But when it comes down to like who I am as a person, I'm kind of irreverent. I'm kind of a brat. Like those are aspects of my personality that I think I love, but you can't really get out there because we're so stuck on this dichotomy between tragedy and triumph, right? Ocean Bong has this wonderful conversation with Brian Washington where he talks about how being just okay is like a radical act. And so I feel like the next chapter of my writing career or existence is kind of me wanting to be openly vulnerable and share I have hot mess moments too, because I think like I see young Filipinos like self-policing into becoming like very, very like manufactured versions of who they think they should be. And it just, I don't want to say it breaks my heart, but I feel like there's so much to who you are as a person that extends beyond what the tropes say you can be. And it's really important for you to lean into that.
Yeah. I'm gonna try to do another one. So this is kind of connected to the first. So how do you approach your work academically when the subject is so close to your own community and background? Oh, that's a great question.
That's a good question. Yeah, I am an academic, forgot. But like my day job is I'm a college professor. I'll come at this question a little differently. I think so I'm a sociologist. I taught classes on race and ethnicity, immigration, gender and sexuality, and the stuff that happens in my life and the stuff that happens in the world broadly really affects that job. So I was teaching gender when the 2016 election happened, right? And so I'm in a school that's predominantly Latina, like my class is predominantly women of color, Latina. Like, how do I grapple with the fact that the person that was elected, and then here I have a classroom trying to, center the experiences of women of color. It just was like incredibly stressful. Like I remember I was teaching a race class, and every single freaking day was like Muslim ban or like some anti-Black Lives Matter comment. Like it was just wild. And so I feel like
sorry, that's my dog now.
Okay. I feel like it was for anyone that writes about this stuff or is like you're an activist or an organizer and you work on these issues that are really really stressing our country out, to put it lightly. I think it's really important to have boundaries and make sure you carve out moments when you can just be yourself, the person you are with your partner, your family, your friends, because otherwise, if the work becomes too intertwined with your identity, I think that can be a very dangerous space. And maybe I'm kind of trying to give myself some advice because this is the advantage of really liking your job and really feeling passionate is you can really end up being a workaholic. And so I have to constantly check myself because burnout is a real thing. People of color passing away early is a real thing because of this kind of work. So I don't know if that gets at your question, but that's how it landed with me. So that's how I'm gonna answer.
All right, we're gonna have to close now. So if you can recommend other books people should check out on social justice and the Filipinx experience, and also make sure to talk about your upcoming publications.
Yeah, first on the list, I would love to recommend this amazing cozy mystery called Arsenic and Adobo, which is the first in the series. Speaking of Filipinos just being able to be themselves as human beings, I think that those books have been such a refuge for me. So Mia's books for sure. But I'm gonna, whenever I hear like folks get asked like what books should we read, I'm always like, come on, recommend a Filipino book, and they never do. And so I'm gonna just list a lot of Filipino books. Queer Filipino books: The Groom Will Keep His Name by Matt Ortile, Ferris by Meredith Talusan. Jose Antonio Vargas has a wonderful book that for all ages called Notes. Oh my God. Notes
like
of
Dear
an
America.
Undocumented Citizen.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name, but it's a yellow cover. a new book is Conception by Albert Samaha. If anyone wants to learn about Philippine history and learn about a Filipino family story, that book is like clutch. And then of course, oh my gosh, like I am this is My American Dream by Malika Gharib. It's a graphic memoir, which I think is just gorgeous. I have so many.
I know.
Carlos Bulason, I'm rereading right now, America is in the Heart. But you know, I think this is a really cool time to just get lost in Filipino American literature. There's poets like Barbara Jane Reyes, psychologists like Kevin Nadal, and E.G. David. But yeah, there's no shortage of Filipino writers that are doing the damn thing. Meredith Talusan's cousin, Grace Talusan, wrote a wonderful memoir called The Body Papers.
Oh, I didn't realize they were related.
Yeah, they're cousins.
Yeah, I have both those memoirs. They're excellent.
Yeah, in fact, when you go to Long Beach, there's a Filipino-owned bookstore called Belcanto.
Belcanto by Joanne. Yeah.
Yeah. If you go to the only bookstore in America that has like a Pinoy section, right? But it has a bunch of the Talusan family books. There's a lot of them that write in that family. So yeah, those are the books I'd recommend. If I had to close with one, I would say my mentor Don Mabalan wrote a classic book, Little Manila is in the Heart. That book is yeah, I wouldn't be who I am and where I'm at without this incredible writer that sadly passed away a couple years ago. So if I had to pick one, I would pick Don Mabalan, Little Manila's in the Heart. So what are yours? Can I hear yours? Is that okay? We have time for that?
Yeah, well, I was looking back at like so many that they're actually like stacked up. I feel like there's a huge amount. So like that's why I was like, that's why I know like Dear America, The Body Papers is right there. The Revolution According to Raimundo Mata by Gina Apostol.
Oh yeah, Gina Apostol, of course.
Because
Leslie
again,
Leslie
Tenorio, Monstrous. And yeah, because I'm very much into Filipinos writing genre. There's like Where Dreams Descend by Janela Angeles.
Wonderful.
Let's see, there's a couple, Trece, the graphic novel. Lola's a graphic novel.
Do you have any of the Erin and Trada Kelly? Like this?
Yes, middle grade. So again, if you want young readers, oh god, Lalani and the something sea, the distant sea.
Yeah.
Where Blackbirds Fly. Yeah.
And oh my gosh, Randy Rebay,
Patron Saints of Nothing.
Yes.
Yeah. That book made me ugly cry. It's excellent.
Yeah. So I mean, truth be told, we could have spent a whole hour just like laying out these books, but I promise you, like dive into these books. They're just incredible. And I you know, if you have kids, for folks out there that have kids, like invest the money for them to have these books within reach, because I think it'll literally, not to be cliche, but I think it can really change their lives and I think it really change our community if young folks get these things really early and they could start becoming producers of culture and knowledge themselves. So
Any Day with You by May Respicio. It's a middle grade novel. It made me cry, not because it was super sad, but just again, it was one of those things where like, I can't believe that kids have this, because I never did. You know, it's a beautiful story of family and Filipino folklore and creativity and the power of words. And I was like, what would this have meant to 12-year-old Mia? I can't even imagine.
Seriously.
You know.
And so if there are any 12-year-olds out there or like aspiring Filipino writers that are like, oh, I love to read, but I could never imagine writing, let me just say, you have a whole community of Filipino writers that are here to embrace you and mentor you and shepherd you through the process. Sanel Barnes, oh my gosh, of course I have to mention Sanel Barnes, but like
Monsoon Mansion.
There are, because the advantage of being a very underrepresented community is that everyone knows each other and become acquainted. So I just want to encourage folks to for all my Filipino folks out there, just please start writing. I would love to see what comes out from your ideas.
And speaking of, what is your upcoming publication? You briefly touched on it, but can you let us know again when it is coming out?
Yeah, it's called Brown and Gay in LA, The Lives of Immigrant Sons.
And when does it come out?
Comes out Virgo season, September 19th.
Ooh, I didn't think about putting it in astrological seasons. So my upcoming book is Blackmail and Babinka. It comes out October 4th, which would make it, was that a Libra?
Yes, it is a Libra.
All right, then. So thank you so much for chatting with me, Anthony. I believe I'm going to turn this back over to Mariella so she can say her closing remarks.
Thank you so much. What a great conversation. I was diligently taking notes, and we can definitely share that list of recommended authors' books, because I really need to read everything. So that's all the time we have this evening. The book again is called The Latinos of Asia, How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race by Dr. Anthony Christian Ocampo. You can check that out and Mia's novels at the Chicago Public Library or any of your other local libraries. And we also encourage you to visit independent bookstore to purchase a copy. Tonight's program will be available on the Chicago Public Library YouTube and Facebook pages. If you have friends who weren't able to join us tonight, please invite them to watch it in demand, and stay tuned to the Chicago Public Library website for many more upcoming virtual events at chipublib.org. Thank you again to Mia and Anthony, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. Have a great night and stay well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.